You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Spark your creativity with The Sims. Sometimes you might feel like you're not creative, and you have to go in search of your creative spark again. Maybe this is catching up with creative friends, experimenting with a new look, or trying out a new recipe. And thanks to The Sims, inspiration is just one game and one spark away. Ready to spark something? Download The Sims 4 and play for free.
Hi, we're pleased today to have John Ellis, who is a former columnist for the Boston Globe. He's worked at News Corp. He has a little piece of history that we're going to talk about related to the 2000 election at the end of this interview. But mainly we're going to speak about his interesting article that he wrote about modern-day Jacksonians and how they're fueling the shape of America's politics in many ways. He has some interesting insight on that. I don't think I've discussed enough in the various episodes that I've had this year. There are some politics going on, and this is a show that does history and politics. It's not an interview show. We're not changing formats by any means. I'll have another episode on Thursday, which will tell the story, deeper story about the Iran hostage crisis of 1980. But today I did want to talk about some current politics. And so you see former President Trump rising both in the polls for the GOP primary and caucuses and also for even the general and inching up over President Biden. I do believe those polls are early. John's going to have some insight into what's fueling that. We just had that episode about the 1980 Iowa caucus and George Bush's surprise win over Ronald Reagan and how he could have almost toppled everything and perhaps gotten the nomination himself. Now, you see the dynamics of Iowa, and the only thing my kind of historical spidey sense is seeing out there is that expectations are so low for the other candidates whose names are not Trump. And it's just always been the case in history that there are surprises in either Iowa or New Hampshire. You see a dynamic between, it appears, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. As one goes up, the other goes down as they fight for that number 2 position, who will come in under Trump. Expectations are so low that I think there possibly could be a surprise. It's coming up January 15th. The Republican contest will be the only one that's important this year because the Democrats, misguidingly, in my opinion, will have a caucus on January 15th, but cannot reveal the results until March 15th. Okay. Our website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. You may want to go there just to check out some of the past episodes that are there. Our Patreon is patreon.com/MHCBUYP. This is now my full-time profession for the time being. And so appreciate any help. You also get some extra episodes. I have some jottings from a recent visit to the library and appreciate that help. Remember, too, we've published Fall of USSR as a separate podcast. If you can go and subscribe to that on Apple Podcasts or other platforms, but particularly helpful is Apple Podcasts. If you can rate and review Fall of USSR as this separate entity so that more people can learn about My History Can Beat Up Your Politics through that source. Thank you. With that, we'll get to our interview with John Ellis. So we're speaking with John Ellis. He is a former NBC News political analyst, Boston Globe columnist, Business Insider political editor, and News Corp veteran. And in 2016, he launched News Items. That is news-items.com for political commentary. John, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's just get right to it, talking about Jacksonians, because you had this very interesting article on your website that talked about Jacksonians as core Trump supporters, kind of explaining some of the Trump phenomenon, not only in 2016, but what's going on right now. Let's talk about them. How would you define Jacksonians? And
there's a very good essay that my friend Walter Mead wrote for Foreign Affairs after Trump was first elected. And he does a better job than I can of describing the Jacksonian culture, if you will. But basically, American politics, there are all these things about what separates us and so on and so forth. The most important thing, I think, in American politics is where you live. And if you think of metropolitan, suburban, exurban, and rural, the Jacksonian base is exurban and rural. And it's less about, usually it's the election of 2016 and 2020 is described, the Trump phenomenon is described as, deindustrialization of the Midwest and political correctness and so on and so forth. But Jacksonian America is really a culture, if you will, and that more than anything else, what it values as opposed to what the quote elites value are very different. And I think the two major components of that, if you will, are a concept of honor and loyalty.
That's a good thought, because one of the first arguments that I will get, or anyone will get, Trump was elected because of the Rust Belt or the wage stagnation or the jobs, the squeeze, is, well, in both 2016 and 2020, people under 50,000 in income voted Democrat. So it doesn't make sense. And they split and battle it out on education levels and other things. But when it comes to just core, economics, it's many blue collar did not vote for Trump and voted for Democrats, and many people making high incomes voted for Trump. So yeah, it requires something more. Talk a bit about the honor part.
Well, I think there's a sense that the quote elites and quote that have sort of defined the liberal order, if you will, in the post-World War II era, their loyalty is perceived as being to themselves and not to the country that, this is all a little bit overstated, but then not loyal to Jacksonian America, not loyal to its values, not loyal to its sense of, what the country is about. And the classic sort of example of it is, I think immigration is an enormously important issue in this election, in the last election, in the 2016 election. Obviously, Trump ran on the, quote, wall, end quote. And that gets assigned the description as racist and, anti-foreign or whatever. But it's more about an assault. I think the more important thing is the sense that their country, their place in the country that they know and love is being undermined by this vast wave of immigration, and that they're asserting themselves to saying that's not our country is our country.
Yeah. And you almost, it's not so much you, but really Walter Mead, almost, at least my read on it, they're almost isolationist. If you're really talking about this core Jacksonian group, and maybe not the next level after that still might vote GOP, they seem to be hey, take care of things here in the home first.
Yeah, I think that's right. On the other hand, if the country is under attack, then Jacksonian, war, right? The Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, etc. The Jacksonian response to that is a total war. We respond, if we come under attack, we wage total war. And the only acceptable outcome of war is the unconditional surrender of the enemy. If you're not going to fight for the unconditional surrender of the enemy, then what's the point? Don't do it. That's a sharp break from 75 years of global order.
Right, détente and things. Yeah. And Kissinger just passed away, and we. It's always been why I. Editorial aside, I've always felt that the argument that Trump and his son and other people on that side of things will make the argument that we're for peace. Never find a group. We don't want to start wars. Like, like some of the Democrats or some of the establishment Republicans do. I always feel like there's some truth in that, and it really should be more explored, particularly on the blue side of politics than it is for, he is a guy that legitimately isn't jumping into wars left and right. But I always feel like the reason I'm skeptical of it is that I feel like, yeah, but once he got into a big one, we'd be in it. So he's not a pacifist by any means, and I'm talking about Trump.
My sort of example of unconditional surrender is, after the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was understandably a lot of second thoughts or afterthoughts about the morality of that. But not in Jacksonian America. Jacksonian America, that led to the unconditional surrender of the enemy. And that is always, when you engage in a foreign battle, that's the goal.
Yeah, I mean, Truman, who oddly enough, I mean, he's a mix because he also has an urban city boss side of his politics where his legacy, but somebody like, I think what a lot of people don't even understand about that situation is Truman really didn't think about it much. In fact, he gave the order to do it to the military already. So this idea that he agonized over it. But you're right. Just a year later, in 46, you have this big book that comes out of Hiroshima and has stories, and it's a bestseller, and it's really from the point of view of the Japanese and the suffering. And so you see this immediate look back at what we did right after that event. But I get it. In parts of America that we're talking about, when you say Jacksonian, my brain goes to Scots-Irish, and I certainly don't want to talk about it as a race, but more as an ancestry. There's a certain group. Jim Webb wrote a great book on it back in the past, and you got certain states and towns in America where when people fill out their census forms, they'll just put American, and what they mean is really they're, some sort of Ulster Irish or somebody that passed through there.
I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, I think the lineage is Scots-Irish.
I think one of the interesting things in this article is you're getting into nuance of these people, the Jacksonians, versus just a kind of the simple stereotypes people talk about it. One of them is that they know Trump is flawed. Oh yeah. Could you expand on that a bit?
I was taken. He's I guess a sociologist that we're not supposed to quote, but Charles Murray was given an interview or something somewhere, and he was talking about the Trump electorate, if you will, the people that elected Trump, and he said they know perfectly well who he is. They know his flaws. In many cases, they share his flaws, but the key to Trump, understanding Trump, is that he's the murder weapon, and I think that's what the purpose he served both in 2016, but also in 2020, and again here in 2023, soon to be 24. There is a elite in Washington that is utterly indifferent to the needs of, and in fact quite scornful of, the views and needs of Jacksonian America, and that it is lined with a lobbyist legal army of people to prevent them from winning any legislative fights, and on and on and on, the litany. And Trump was essentially the grenade that they threw into that conclave. I guess another form.
Murder weapon sounds extreme, but I get it, and it's like a form that I say is I hear a lot. He fights. Yeah, what they used to say about U.S. Grant. Why is he a good general? He fights. Yeah, I mean they don't. Why put a person? They've been running candidates that have lost. Democrats went through the same thing. Carter wins narrow, Carter loses, Mondale loses, Dukakis loses. It's time for someone that's going to win. Right. Our it's not exactly equatable, but Clinton's kind of our stealth bomber murder weapon. If one's on the left side of things, like, hey, we got a guy that can talk like you a little and can figure out some of what to say, quote the Bible once in a while, and sort of mean it. I mean, to some extent, and win Arkansas and Tennessee, and
Right.
of course that's the change. Democratic Party kind of abandon that kind of Clintonian, or don't try to be Reagan, don't try to be.
The key thing to understanding, I think, Clinton is that the bridge to the Republican Party for the Jacksonians was Perot. And Perot took 19% of the vote in 1992, which enabled Clinton to win the election outright with 43% of the vote. Perot did less well the next time, 10%. But Clinton won that election with 46% of the total vote. So it in the way that Wallace was the bridge from the old Democratic coalition for a big, essentially the old Confederacy, for those voters to move from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. In Clinton's case, what happened was that some element of the Jacksonian constituency departed the H.W. Bush sort of republicanism, if you will, and found its home in the Perot, I guess, movement. And that's the thing about Trump, is that it's not, I like to say that Trump is less important now than the movement, that what the movement is interested in is the movement. And that Trump is simply the weapon that they use to make themselves heard.
Yeah. So, boy, there's so many ways to get into that. And it really is a lot different than what people talk about daily on things. There's a lack of understanding of some of these mechanics going on. There seemed to be a movement, which no doubt Rupert Murdoch, who has been known to kind of back candidates succession style, right, it seemed to be, okay, we're going to take DeSantis, we're going to first prop him up, win a big re-election as governor, and we're just going to kind of ease Donald Trump out of the chair, take the keys away, is the way I almost see it. And boy, that didn't work.
I say about Fox News that it's not, the network doesn't program the audience programs the network. And I think the people that program the network and the people that own the network had enough of Trump after he lost in 2020. And you can hear and read all of the arguments essentially in the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, which is, it's not like Paul Gigot, who's the editor of the editorial pages, is the stenographer for Rupert Murdoch, but their thinking is, let's put it this way, is very closely aligned. And Paul argued after Trump was lost that not only did Trump lose the executive branch, but he caused the Republicans to lose the House in 2018. And he caused the Republicans to lose the Senate in 2020, and therefore he was a loser. And as a loser, he was no longer really of use to the Murdoch empire, if you will. And they were looking around for somebody to make sure that Trump went away. And there was Ron DeSantis, who had just won a stunning re-election, 60% of the vote. He carried Dade County. Looked all the, he just looked all the part of a future presidential candidate and a future president. They were comfortable with him. They liked the fact that he could replace Trump. They liked the fact that he could, adopt a number of the themes that Trump had hit on. And they went all in. The famous New York Post headline was not DeSantis, it was the future. And that reflected Fox News, Wall Street Journal editorial page, New York Post, which is sort of the first responder of the Murdoch media empire. And what happened was they got ahead of their audience, and the audience wasn't quite ready to get rid of Mr. Trump. And when 2022 happened, again, the Democrats surprisingly did much better in the House than anybody thought they would. They held on to the Senate. The Murdoch empire, again, this is overstated, but the Murdoch media conglomerate, if you will, said that yet again, Trump had caused the Republican Party to lose, and therefore we had to go even further in. I have DeSantis' timing wrong, by the way. He was reelected in 2022. But anyway, so they said that Trump had caused the Republicans to lose, and so we needed somebody who was electable and all this stuff. And the audience didn't buy it, and the audience wasn't quite ready to let Trump go. And part of that was the disrespect the audience felt, the disrespect that the audience felt that was being paid or was being exhibited by media generally, and the Murdoch media specifically, that they weren't gold watching Trump. They weren't retiring him with praise. And I put it in a column. I said they want to hear the eulogy before they bury the guy. And there was no eulogy, and that was resented. And then Trump came under attack legally from the Justice Department and from the media, and even the closest allies in the media were now attacking him or trying to keep him from being heard, with the exception, obviously, of Sean Hannity. But nowhere else didn't appear on Fox News for a long, months and months and months. And the audience wasn't having it. And so they reprogrammed the network, and Trump is back. That's basically what happened.
You mentioned the indictments, and what about those, though? Is that seems like a big factor from the first New York indictment? He gets a martyr effect, if you will, or some kind of like, right. Look, I'm the victim type effect. And he's beating DeSantis. I mean, some of those early polls were showing DeSantis doing well.
Yeah, getting close. There's no doubt. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was sort of a 40-30 situation. Trump had definitely come down from the 50 plus to the, low 40s, even 39, I remember in one poll. And DeSantis had sort of shot up in large part because he was being advertised as the next thing. Then Trump, I mean, the timing is not exact, but then Trump comes under legal threat. And the cases, the first two, the rape case with the woman who had I can't remember her name, but she had a column in Elle magazine and so on and so forth. That seemed to be preposterous given the time difference, right? I mean, she waited, I think, 30 years or something to bring the case. So that was deemed to be an unfair attack. And then the real estate case here in New York is really mind-boggling, because you would think that the banks that were lending him the money didn't have the right to do due diligence. Of course they did. And they were fine with making the loans. And as a friend of mine actually was part of the group that was lending Trump money at the time, or lending the Trump organization money at the time. And he said, look, he got into trouble. We did we saw the due diligence, and what we did was we got ever better collateral and in return for giving him the money that he needed to keep going. Had he gone, bust, we would have had fantastic collateral. So anyway, that case,
but once you're a bank, obviously you're subject to federal rules, and you've got to do, if you've anyone filling out an application has to present things accurately. The bank has investors that may not be the management and know about all the little deals that are being made. So there's all of these I don't want to I do understand, though, that for all of these, there's particularly the first New York indictment, there's a little element of it. Well, it seems small given the person, but then the other side, given that it's the former president of the United States, it seems small to go on this small business.
And also comparatively, if Donald Trump is the only one who's overvaluing his real estate holdings, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn.
On one hand, you have the adage, no one's above the law, right? And that's if there's a Whig ethic. We talked about Jacksonians. If there's a Whig ethic here, it's no one's above the law, and and we do our jobs, and the government has to function well and be fair and all of those things. And then on the other hand, there's a group of people who are, you're just doing this because it's Trump, and it's almost bound to happen. I do wonder if the indictments didn't happen, say, if we just see DeSantis slowly getting that nomination. Do you remember when, I know I'm jumping a bit here, but do you remember when Trump first made his announcement? There was kind of a goofiness to it, or there was a lot of criticism of it. And
I was in Roger Ailes' office when it took place. I was working for Roger. He had hired me to try to figure out what to do with the Fox Business Network, which was my job. I had consulted with him. I'd never worked at Fox or at News Corp. I'd only done consulting work for them. But in 2014, I think it was, Roger hired me and said, we got to figure out what to do with the business network. And so, because as Roger, you were always invited down to talk about politics. And that day I was invited down to look at the Trump announcement. And, he rode down the elevator, and I mean, it just seemed preposterous. And the next day they looked at the ratings, and he had doubled the ratings in that time period, more than doubled the ratings in that time period. And that's when Fox News Channel realized that they had essentially struck gold.
I'm Mo Rocca, and I'm excited to announce Season 4 of my podcast, Mobituaries. I've got a whole new bunch of stories to share with you about the most fascinating people and things who are no longer with us. From famous figures who died on the very same day, to the things I wish would die, like buffets. All that and much more. Listen to Mobituaries with Mo Rocca wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
It's always tough with the Jackson thing. We hear it a lot. It's also tough because he's Trump himself. I mean, he put Jackson up in the White House and put the portrait up in an elevated spot. He's made the comparison. Supporters, want that comparison to happen, which always leads to the question, if we're really looking at it, it's like how much of it is, well, yeah, you're a Jacksonian because you want to be Jacksonian, just like if Biden wants to say he's Truman, he can do it, and we can start to, those associations will start to happen. I see lots of things like obviously anti-establishment, no-brainer between the Jackson and between Trump. For the purpose, because it is a history show, I think there's a couple of contrasts that I should point out, at least for the audience, that I would see. They may not be as important to people today, but one would be military experience. I mean, Jackson's strength came from his status as a military hero. Tariff, he's low tariff. Donald Trump is at least depending on the, for some countries, high tariff. Immigration, I mean, the Democratic Party at the time Jackson was in there relied on a very expansive immigration and small L liberal immigration policy. This one's a little more subjective, but he's a unionist. Of course, everyone's a unionist, so that's a bad argument. But for instance, he wouldn't tolerate like a fire eater type politics. And when South Carolina tried that, he nullified. And so there's a lot to Jackson that's it's always hard, there's comparisons and contrasts. But I think a more relevant one to what we're talking about is simply that Jackson got a popular vote. And Trump still, through the 2 elections, has yet to do that. Now, maybe it happens in 2024. The people are, the way current polls, which I think are early, we can look at the people and say they're Jacksonians. It's harder to look at Trump and say he's Jackson.
No, yeah. I mean, he doesn't fit the mold. It's more he fits the culture. And that's that he tapped into, that he understands. I think that's Trump has a very almost feral understanding of what drives modern populism in the United States. And but you're right. I mean, Jackson, 56% of the vote. Trump will never get 56% of the vote. He'll win the election if he does in 2024 with less than 50%. The last 2 elections, he lost the popular vote by 3 million in 2016 and to Biden by 7 million. So, you know, he's going to win because the Electoral College makes it possible for him to win, not because he's overwhelmingly popular.
Yeah, it's always a nuanced argument, because I see it out there on the boards and the like, is that everyone will say people keep saying that Trump has all this popular support, he doesn't win popular vote. But within this group, it is his popularity that drives his performance in the GOP primaries, his personal charm within that group.
Right.
Yeah, let me throw something at you. If Nikki Haley was the candidate, do you think Jacksonians vote for her?
No, I mean, I think the people that let me put it this way. I think the turnout would be down in exurban and rural counties. I think it would fall off. One of the arguments, the loser argument, Trump is a loser, completely falls apart if you look at what happened in 2020, because underneath the statewide and federal races, the Republicans ran the table as never before. State houses, state legislatures, statewide offices, Secretary of State, Attorney General, that sort of thing. It was a landslide for the Republicans, and that was driven by increased turnout in rural and exurban counties, essentially, and communities. And so is Nikki Haley, does she inspire that kind of enthusiasm or devotion or whatever the word is? No, she does not. That said, she's a lot more attractive to suburban America than Trump is, relatively speaking. Much less of the, quote, Trump anxiety, end quote. Obviously, Trump being that she's Nikki Haley, and at the moment has a rather wide lead over President Biden. My own view is that Biden is, I don't know. My personal view is that Biden's chances of reelection are, 20%.
Yeah, wasn't that Trump's chance in 2015?
No, he can. I'm not saying he can't. I'm not saying he can't win. I'm just saying we have not ever, in my lifetime anyway, we've never had a candidate, an incumbent president, who has the following data working for him. 80% of the U.S. electorate would prefer that he not seek reelection. I mean, it's just an absolutely stunning statistic. And it makes reelection, it makes the reelection of Biden, the pitch, you should reelect Joe Biden, impossible. And so the framing of the election from Biden's point of view has to be what he says, which is, I may not be the greatest thing, but consider the alternative. And that's what the Democratic campaign is going to be. It's not pro-Biden, but consider the alternative.
So Mike Dukakis in 1988 gets 45.7% of the vote. This is something that's always interested me since 2016. There was no one declaring that, America, there's a large group of technocrats waiting to take over America now, because he got this. Trump gets 46.1 in 2016. So in 1988, 45.7, Dukakis is the loser and one of history's, let's say, greatest, one of those names that just comes out in presidential history. And it's amazing. And then Trump gets 46.1, which is 0.4% more of popular vote. And it's a revolution. Doesn't have that broad popular vote.
This has been said again and again, but the electoral college system, if you will, at this point in time is almost perfectly designed to elect a Republican. And that you see that, I remember in 2020, I was on a panel and I said that Biden had to win by at least 6 million votes, national popular vote, in order to win in the Electoral College. And I was off by 1 million. I was underestimating it by 1 million. He won by more than 7 million votes, and he barely won the Electoral College. And so given that advantage, you look at the polls, people say, well, Trump and Biden, it's all within the margin of error and so on and so forth. It's within the margin of error. Trump is going to win in the Electoral College because, just to take 2020 as an example, Biden wins by 7. And in New York, he wins by 2 million. In California, he wins by 5 million. And there's your 7 million. All, quote, wasted vote, end quote. And so that's the thing is people, well, Biden will catch up, so on and so forth. But Trump need only lose the national popular vote by 6 million votes to win in the Electoral College.
These are great points for understanding. I don't think are really the kind of things being discussed much with this group, the Jacksonians. It does strike me though that it couldn't just have been discovered. I hear what you're saying, that he's just has this feral sense of them and he's so good at this group, but it had to be the same group that George W. Bush and Karl Rove had identified and were going after. And even to the loyalty, it seemed like it. I look at 2004. This is essentially a GOP group that has been targeted over the years.
Has been, but I think the thing that really changed everything in American politics was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. There was a case where the elites took care of the elites. The most astonishing figure about the financial crisis was that exactly one person went to jail. And he was a UBS trader, I think. I mean, it was like the poor guy, right? Of all the people in the world, it's me. But if you look at the early part of the George W. Bush administration, Ken Lay and Enron and all of those people, there were I think I can't remember the actual number, but related to financial wrongdoing, there were 700 or 800 prosecutions. If you go back to George H.W. Bush and the S&L crisis, there were 1,100 indictments, most of which ended up with people going to jail, including the famous Charles Keating. In 2008, 2009, there were no prosecutions. There were no indictments. And so it was a classic example of the elites from the point of view of Jacksonian America, if you will. And again, this is overstated, but from that point of view of ex-urban, especially ex-urban and rural voters, it was like, this is unbelievable. They've cratered the financial system, and they're getting bailed out, and they're not going to jail. And I think that was the thing that broke the deal.
Yeah, I've heard that before from both left and right. I did an episode back in the past in the 30s, and there was the various hearings in the 30s where they would haul some of these bankers before congressional committees and Well,
Right.
very little of that. I mean, very little of that. It was like, let's just move on and get that economy humming again.
Right,
So,
right. And here's, $5 trillion to help you go. I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm interested, but the meetings, instead of there being prosecutions, instead of there being, brutal congressional hearings, all of the meetings took place at the Federal Reserve in New York, and all of the limos pulled up and the people got out and they had the meetings in secret, and they got in their limos and they drove home, and lo and behold, $1 trillion came to bail them out. That's obviously a wildly oversimplified view. And yes, the financial system was indeed in peril globally. And that there was probably no other option to do what George W. and Bernanke and Paulson decided to do, essentially. But it was perceived as insiders taking care of insiders, and to hell with the rest of you.
great point. Yeah, not enough done there. One could say, well, that should have been a boomerang to Bush GOP. That should have been right a mark on them. But I've always noticed that Trump is able to separate very well. Of course, he took on Jeb Bush in the 2016 election. He's he's able to not really take the party without taking the mantle of the party.
Yeah, I mean, they transformed the party. I mean, people talk about the Republican Party this and the Republican Party that. The Republican Party, as you and I knew it 20 years ago or 25 years ago, no longer exists. It's the Trump Party. And then there are these sort of old timers, if you will. It's like old timers day at Fenway Park or something, that are, quote, traditional Republicans or Reagan Republicans or Bush Republicans. But the party, the actual, the makeup of the party is this Jacksonian base, and the party should properly be called the Trump Party.
Given that you were at Fox, what do you think about the OAN and Newsmax as threats to Fox News and the business?
When Roger was, he was chief executive from the beginning, but as it became more and more successful, he became more and more concerned about a challenge, right? Because he'd gone from being the challenger to now being the champ. And so, like all champs, he was worried about where he might be attacked. And there was a lot of survey research done, and basically somewhere between 25% and 30% of the Fox News Channel's audience thought that Fox was either too liberal or too moderate. And so Roger was very concerned that that would coalesce around a network, and that would damage his baby, and would cause the profits to decline. So Roger did a lot of interesting things. The most sort of underappreciated thing he did was that he signed every imaginable conservative talking head to contracts with Fox News Channel. So John Bolton, future national security advisor to President Trump, was paid $500,000 a year to be a talking head on Fox News Channel. Arguably, you could have done that, cheaper. But Roger's idea was that John Bolton might be one of the voices of a new conservative network. And so he wasn't going to allow that to happen. And by the time it got to 2016, Roger employed basically everyone who had any stature at all in conservative politics. And so if you and I decided, okay, we're going to come after Fox News on the right, we would look around and say, every single person is under contract to Fox. So there was that. There's still such demand that, OAN and Newsmax were, in fact, they got some money, they got on channels and so on and so forth. If you go back to the beginning of Fox News Channel, Cablevision at that time, the cable news operator in the New York area, had 3 million customers, right? And so it was an important, distributor. And the way it works in cable television is that the cable systems pay you for your content. Rupert flipped that around and paid Cablevision $10 for every single subscriber in order to get on the cablevision system. And the rough math of cable television is that in order to break even, you have to be in 65 million homes. Rupert bought his way into 65 million homes, and then he lost money on Fox News Channel, I think, for 8 to 10 years. That's a long time to lose money, particularly if you're a public corporation, but he kept at it. And then the breakthrough, obviously, was Monica Lewinsky. They started printing money. So the short on that is that it takes an enormous amount of money, and it takes enormous patience and forbearance to build an opinion, if you will, news network. And, OAN and Newsmax, they don't have that kind of money. They don't have that kind of perseverance. They don't have that kind of grit and credibility in the markets. So, they had these brief moments where it appeared that they might present a challenge, but they were never, ever a threat.
And since we have you on, John Ellis, I also want to remind people that you have the site, and you have your own media site, news-items.com. Do I have that right? Yeah, make sure I have that right. And how's that going? It's going well?
I started it as a newsletter. It's interesting because I started in 2016, and the idea of it was to make the people at Fox News Channel and at the News Corp news properties, which New York Post, Wall Street Journal, etc., sort of aware of stories that they might not otherwise be aware of and trends that they might not otherwise see. And the idea was because everybody knew that Clinton was going to be Trump, you might as well, fill the hole, if you will, with other takes on what was going on. And of course, the thing that happened that sort of launched it was that Rupert liked it. And so Rupert would say to people, have you read John's note? Have you read this? Did you see what John said about this or whatever? And of course, when Rupert liked it, everybody else had to like it too. And so that gave it its initial push. And then I left in 2019, and I asked if I could take News Items with me, and he very generously said yes. And so the next day after I left, I started News Items. I just kept going and had this small subscriber base, a publishing platform called Substack. That sort of slow and steady wins the race. What's changed in the Substack universe is that when I started, there were, I'm going to say 25 people that were in and around the news business. And now there are like,
few more.
There are literally hundreds of thousands of Substacks. So it's harder to get through. But we're having success. We've added political news items for 2024. And my friend Joe Klein and I just started a podcast, which actually just went up about 45 minutes ago, the first one. And we're going to do a weekly podcast together. So that'll be fun.
Oh, great. What's the name of that?
Night Owls.
Okay.
Joe stays up late and reads, and I start my workday at 1 a.m. So we're calling it Night Owls.
That's great. That's great. So anyone, people listening will say, okay, you have John Ellis on, so you got to ask him about, especially being a history show, you got to ask him about the 2000 election and the call made at Fox News to call Florida for George W. Bush in 2000. You were part of a team that made that call. I mean, all right, first of all, are you kind of tired of telling the story these days, and any thoughts, any perspective, 23 years now from that? I
haven't really talked or thought about. Every so often a reporter or somebody writing a book about 2020 or whatever will call me and ask me about it. I think the thing I took away from it is, the good news is that we weren't the only ones who called a state the wrong way on the same night, right? Twice on the same night. We were the last to call Gore the winner in Florida.
I remember that
in the 9 to 10 p.m. frame. And
I was with a group of people who were, let's just say, rooting for Gore, and but we're like, we are going to put this on Fox because when they call it, Gore won.
Yeah.
Of course,
yeah.
So who knew?
It was weird because the numbers we had, most of the exit poll was in, and a number of the key precincts were in. And by we called it at 9:46. We were last to call it. But the system, the models, the algorithm showed that Bush literally couldn't win the state of Florida. And one of the things when you're running a decision desk, you're not picking winners. You're picking the person. You're looking for the person who can't possibly win. That's the key. Is the 99% chance that George W. Bush would lose Florida. That's where we got at the time that we got there. And we were late, as I said. In 2:00 in the morning, Bush, what was out looked Bush to us. And the debate that we had, and he was ahead at that point, about 25 or 30,000 votes. What remained looked Bush to us. And then the votes in Volusia County switched. And that happened after we made the call for Bush. And looking back, the way we did on big calls, quote unquote, big calls, the group, which was myself, there was a pollster named John Gorman, who was Jimmy Carter's pollster in 1976, he was partnered with Pat Caddell at the time. A friend of mine named Arnon Mishkin, who's now head of the Fox News Channel's decision desk. And then there was a woman whose name I forget, but she was an assistant to John Gorman. And on, quote, big calls, end quote, the four of us had to agree, right, that there had to be unanimity on a call. And certainly there had to be unanimity on a call that was going to call the results of the election. So we all agreed at around, I can't remember, 2:15 a.m. or something. And we made the call. And about a minute later, CBS News made the call, and then ABC, and then NBC. Shortly thereafter, I did an interview with a person I thought was a friend of mine from the New Yorker. That came out, and there was a lot of drama because I'm related to the Bush family. My mother,
the Ellises and the Bushes, yeah.
And my mother was Nancy Bush Ellis, and so was the Democrats. Very cleverly made an issue of my being the head of the decision desk, and that the fix was in, and so on and so forth. And people would ask me about it, and I would say, well, I never realized I had the power to make CBS call for Bush and make NBC call for Bush and make ABC call for Bush. But if I did have that power, it was fleeting. Let's put it that way.
You ever talk to anybody at those networks? You ever get that side of the story? Did they say, "Oh, after Fox"? I can't imagine why CBS would have to do it after Fox. Doesn't seem like pressure on a network.
No,
like
the same. I assume that I never talked to Warren Matofsky, and who was the head of the CBS unit, and I don't know, but I assume they just saw the same data we did, right? I mean, Bush was ahead. What was out looked like Bush. And in retrospect, I think the mistake that we made was, even if Bush had won, even if what we had thought occurred had in fact occurred, we would have been inside of the rules for a recount. I think we pressured ourselves when we could have said, you know what, this result, even if Bush wins by 45,000 votes, that's inside the automatic recount territory. So let's just sit back and let that happen.
Too close to call, yeah. It's interesting because nowadays everyone's doing it at their home computers with very elaborate reporting that comes in. We're all mini John Ellis is now doing our own calls, like, hey, honey, I think Wisconsin's going to Biden. These days, I mean, because look at the Dane counties looking good. So we're all kind of doing it.
I will say one other thing. The oddest thing to me about election nights is Fox called Arizona for Biden, right? 1047, something like that. And an hour and a half later, the AP called Arizona for Biden, right? And number one, it doesn't matter if Fox and the AP call it or the others don't. Eventually, the vote will be tabulated and someone will have won and someone will have lost, right? Now, of course, it's in terms of the news media, what people believe. And so, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because somebody got this amount of votes and the other person got this amount of votes, and that's the result. What's really weird about the modern media culture is, and this is fed, by Trump, who said, this Arizona call is an outrage, Fox, they should go to jail, whatever. But they said nothing about the AP, which arguably is more important because it reaches a much larger news distribution. It's the one thing I never understood. Calls are the calls, and the networks do it as part of the general obligation they have in return for the charters that they have. But you count votes. That's what matters. And this emphasis on what Fox says or what NBC says about the outcome of the election, at some level, it has no bearing on what the final result will be.
Well, it's the sportsification of, it's part of that. It's one of many things that come out of that, where probably from the 90s, where it's you're counting score. It's a race. Who's going to win the race? He's in the lead. Well, no one's, as you just said, no one's in the lead. It's just, can Dane County get the dang ballots counted already?
Right.
And if they counted quicker than the other counties, then the other one would be in the lead. Nobody's actually running. It's kind of extends to the campaign. It's like, who's in the lead right now, or who's in the, for all you know, some event could happen tomorrow and the campaign could be upended, So yeah. It's this, you don't get any points like in a game, where somebody told me, of course I'm going on a tangent, but somebody said the other day, like, it's hard if you're going into the fourth quarter and your team's 3 touchdowns down, it's hard to win. And I said, well, in politics, you don't have to worry because those 3 touchdowns are meaningless. Whatever, you could be 55% in the polls, and then one day, if an event happens, say a lousy debate performance or some foreign, look at what happened October 7th. I mean, there are things that could upend all of these politics. None of that previous score matters. So the sportsification, which it seems like what you're describing is an element of, like, people constantly saying, I want to know who's in the lead. And it's even being accelerated by some of the networks, the Kornackiism, like, kind of like, this vote's coming in. If it keeps coming in on this level, then Biden's going to overtake Trump. Like, well, again, yeah, there should be more accuracy about what you're actually describing, which is votes being counted. But, and I think you're right, John. I actually think it might be adding to some of the agita, the way that it's presented too. Yeah. That it adds to some of the annoyance about it. I thought my guy was leading, and now they're not. That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, well, this has been great. Thanks for coming on, John Ellis. Appreciate you coming on. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.